Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to rise this evening to speak to Bill C-46. This bill presents a number of complicated and novel problems for lawmakers. I will say, first of all, that I will vote for this bill at second reading. I think it should get to committee. There are many things in here that we need to move ahead with, and I hope that my speech can reflect on those areas where I think we need to reflect and where the bill will need amendments, and particularly in the sections which enable the Governor General to make regulations in future, that we approach regulation making with caution. So let me first start by saying what I think is important about C-46. It's important that we do more to deal with carnage on our roads caused by people who are so, well, their judgment is impaired by drinking. But the failure to understand that an automobile is a lethal weapon, that getting behind the wheel when you've had anything to drink at all should be as socially unacceptable today as it now is to light up a cigarette on an elevator. Social norms change over time. And the social norm that once allowed us to give the people around us the present of secondhand smoke without thinking anything about it is now viewed as a reckless activity. One would have thought that with the attention, with the hard work of wonderful groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that it would be clear to all Canadians as responsible citizens that if you've had anything to drink at all, you don't drive. Unfortunately, we see far too many examples of innocent people, children, whole families killed on our highways by people who have gotten behind the wheel when they should never have done so. And we need to do more to stop the threat of drunk drivers on our roads. This bill begins to do that, and this bill begins to take some important steps. Certainly, it's important to say that people need to know that they can be pulled over and have a breath test applied as a roadside breathalyzer test on a reasonable grounds test, which is going to allow more police officers to stop more people, and on randomized breathalyzer testings on the side of the road if they think that person has, and it does require reasonable grounds. I mean, in going through Bill C-46, it's important to note that it does require that a police officer has reasonable grounds to believe a person is committing, or at any time within the last 3 hours has committed an offense as a result of consumption of drug or alcohol, has committed an offense. The evaluating officer has reasonable grounds. Throughout this, there are requirements for reasonable grounds, but still the test for giving a roadside breathalyzer test is going to be reduced with the goal of getting more people who are drinking and driving off our roads. And I think that's important. The risk here is that we are now conflating the legalization of cannabis with problems of driving and substance abuse. And here's where I think we need to be careful. In 2014, an astonishing 74,800 cases were reported across Canada of driving impaired due to alcohol or drug use. 74,800 cases in a single year reported by police. Of those cases, 97% were alcohol, 3% were drugs. Now, that's not to say that drugs aren't the problem, but it's clear that in order of priority, alcohol is the bigger problem as a percentage empirically on our roads. But then you begin to dive into it, and certainly with the legalization of cannabis, good and reasonable concerns have been raised. What if people are impaired by having imbibed and smoked, eaten edible cannabis, if people are now under the influence of cannabis and there's THC in their system? And this is where, as I dive into the evidence, it gets a lot more complicated. Because if we're going to base our policies on evidence, it's not at all clear that the same kind of physiological effects occur from imbibing cannabis as from drinking alcohol. For example, studies by the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation, as reported in the New York Times, talk about the estimate from a number of studies that compared with the dangers of drunken driving, for instance, 20-year-old drivers with a blood alcohol content of 0.08%, which is the legal limit across Canada, had an almost 20-fold increase in the risk of a fatal accident. But when they look at those who have imbibed cannabis, for example, they find that the effect of using cannabis is within it does affect driving, but it's within the same range as legal allowable levels of blood alcohol. It's not at all clear, and according to a 2012 study from the Journal of Psychopharmacology, only 30% of people who were under the influence of THC failed a field test of their ability to show physical coordination and good cognitive reflexes. The effect of smoking marijuana is clearly going to be very different than the effect of drinking and driving. This is again research from the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation. They concluded that, for purposes of explaining this, we're going to use the terms stoned drivers and drunk drivers, that stoned drivers drive differently from drunken ones and have different deficits. Drunken drivers tend to drive faster than normal and overestimate their skills, whereas the opposite is true for stoned drivers. More worrying when you're dealing with application of criminal law is that those who are habitual users of marijuana can have levels of THC in their system that do not affect their judgment, but the metabolization in the body of cannabis is very different than that of alcohol. To spot someone who's drunk, you need to test for ethanol. To spot someone who has been using cannabis, you look for THC. But the THC can be present in the bloodstream days after the last use and when a person is not actually impaired. So we need to, as we're going forward with developing tests and deciding when someone is criminally responsible, we need to approach this problem differently than we do with, we found levels of blood alcohol of 80 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood, and therefore we know you are driving over the limit. That's not going to be so easy for figuring it out with THC. Now, those who are studying this recommend some interesting approaches, including, by the way, this very useful study from the U.S. Department of Transportation from February 2015 on drug and alcohol crash risks. I recommend this to other MPs who are looking for data. It's from as I said, from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And they looked at the adjustment for age, gender, ethnicity, alcohol concentration levels, and so on. They did not find that high risk correlated with drug use at all when you correct for these other social factors, age, ethnicity, and so on. What they do recommend, which I think is fascinating, is as we go forward for legalization of cannabis, they say, look, if you're going to put your resources where you want to put them to avoid people being killed on roadsides, it would be far better to focus on banning establishments for imbibing cannabis away from home. Now, I want to underscore this because I don't think anyone's mentioned it in debate so far. If we're, as we are, legalizing cannabis, don't have facilities and establishments that encourage people to get in their car to drive to a place to go have cannabis. Encourage, if you're going to legalize cannabis, which we are, that there's no driving involved, that you're home before you imbibe, that we create the social norms that say don't drive at all in imbibing cannabis, because it's going to be very, very hard, and I think it's going to be a failing test on the science to find mechanisms for roadside testing for THC. Far better to focus on where the threat to life and limb clearly is, overwhelmingly, on people who get behind the wheel of the car after having too much to drink. And frankly, I think a glass of wine or a beer is too much to drink to get behind the wheel of the car, and yet we have a social construct. Our culture, and there's nothing wrong with it. You know, I've always loved the show Cheers. The friendly guy behind the bar. You should take a bus there. Take the subway there. We need to change our norms around what's okay, because a car is a lethal weapon. Lastly, I want to hope that when we take this bill to committee, we look at issues of unintentional consequences. If we make it easier for police officers to pull someone over for a breathalyzer, We need to watch for issues of racial profiling. We need to watch for unintended consequences of additional searches that take place once you've pulled someone to the side of the road. I'm not standing against this bill by any means, but I think these issues are far more complicated than the debate we've had so far tonight. I look forward to seeing this bill go to committee. I hope that when we look at regulating THC and finding ways to do roadside testing, that we don't start with the assumption that if we can find THC in your body, you have been reckless in your use of an automobile. Those two may not correlate the way blood alcohol levels indeed correlate towards recklessness and unsafe driving. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.